All right. So I would love for all of you to introduce yourselves and then to tell us a little bit about yourself, your winery, how you got into this, and then we can talk more about your specific wineries. So Bill, why don't we, I noticed that this was totally unplanned, but it's kind of cool. We are the ABC gang tonight, ACORN, Bruliam, Crux, right? So because of that, I would like to start with ACORN. Bill, unmute your mic and here, I can unmute you too. Let's go for it.
Okay.
Tell us about you and the winery.
So I'm Bill Nachbaur. We own ACORN Winery, Alegria Vineyards. We've had the vineyard for 30 years. We specialize in field blends. Every wine we make is a blend of grapes that we pick, where we pick multiple grapes at the same time and co-ferment them. That has allowed me to plant about 100 different varieties. So it's a pretty crazy place. But we do that because it makes the wine more interesting and more complex to have. So it's like making a stew, to have the different grapes interacting right from the beginning. And you get unique flavors and a lot of complexity.
Amazing. So can you talk about some of the types of wines that you make in those field blends?
Well, the original field blend is from a Zinfandel vineyard that was planted in 1890. Our Zinfandel is 78% Zin and about 10% each Petit Syrah, Alicante Boucher, and then the last 2% is 15 other grapes that are sprinkled around the vineyard. So there's Trousseau and Negrette and Carignan and Syrah and Sangiovese, Palomino, Montbedon, a few others.
Bazillion others.
Just a few others. But that we liked that wine so well that inspired us to make every wine the same way. This field blending kind of went out of style after Prohibition, but we're bringing it back.
Okay, so Kerith, you're B. So you tell us a little bit about your winery, and then we'll move on to Crux.
Awesome, thank you. I want to thank Laura and Elizabeth for having all of us here tonight, and thank everybody for tuning in the busy lead up to the holidays. Happy 8th night of Hanukkah for everybody out there, and happy Merry Christmas and happy holidays to everyone celebrating ahead. So with that, I'm Kerith Overstreet. I am the winemaker, the marketer, the tech sheet writer, and the tank shoveler for Bruliam Wines. I have been making wine since 2008, but it is my second career. Actually, when I was growing up, my dad said to me, "You can be whatever you want after medical school." And I held up my end of the deal. So I went to medical school and I did an internship in general surgery. I did a residency, I did a fellowship, and then I did another fellowship. And then I decided, I think I'd rather be a winemaker. So I went back to UC Davis and started making wine in 2008. I'm super lucky to do what I love to do, and it takes a ton of family support, as everyone here can attest who has a small family winery. So Bruliam is named for my kids, Bruno, Lily, Amelia. And Bruliam sounds like cadmium or polonium. So our original logo is a riff on the periodic table of elements. It's a dorky insider science joke and a nod to the fact that I went to medical school. I make mostly Pinot Noir, but I also make Zinfandel from Rockpile. I make a high acid Sonoma Coast Chardonnay. I've made dessert wine before. And tonight, I think we're talking about my rosé of Pinot Noir. So cheers, everybody, and thank you for having me.
Yay. Okay. Guys from Crux. Hello. Brian, Steve.
Sorry. Had to find the mute button. And
yeah,
we
I gotta
both
hit
have
that.
to be unmuted so we can talk
right,
over each other and contradict each other and all that.
That's right.
Fun stuff. Steve,
Well, we are
first.
Crux. Okay, I'll go first. We are Rhone specialists,
Okay.
Rhone varietal specialists, that is. You can't hear me, right?
Hello?
We can hear you.
Okay. So we do Grenache Blanc, Viognier, Grenache, a GSM blend, Petit Syrah, Zinfandel, a non-Rhone, and I think I got them all. Primarily in the Russian River Valley. We do play with some other varietals in other places a little bit, not very much. Our focus is right around our homes here in the Russian River Valley and Rhone varietals. Brian and I launched the brand in 2012 after making a lot of wine in our garage for something like, I don't know, 7 or 10 years. And doing our thing in the garage, and it was a slippery slope. We produced more and more wines of different types. Kind of found our motivation to stick with Rhone varietals because for the simple reason that we like to drink them the most, and felt that it was in particular good in this area that we are in. We started out planting and growing all of our own fruit for our little project. We outgrew our vineyards at some point. Now we purchase somewhere 70 to 80% of our grapes, but we still have our vineyards that we started with. We grow most varietals of our own and then source externally as well. But we pretty much work with the same growers year after year with the intent of kind of treating them like our own, farming them the same way and producing the wine the same way each year.
Brian, do you have anything to add?
I'm back. Yeah, well, besides the Rhones, we do actually make a Zinfandel, which I'm drinking right now. It's we love Russian River Zin. Our vineyards are about a couple miles south of the beautiful Alegria vineyard. So we're all neighbors and friends and happy to be here together. So thanks for joining us.
Awesome.
It is a great trio to be a part of.
The ABCs. I love it.
Right.
Right. I'm sorry. Oh, well, Kerith makes Chardonnay, so she might have a really big problem with that. I don't know. Because that has another connotation. All right. So I want to ask, what is your overarching philosophy? You talked about the kinds of wines that you made, but Bill, let's pop it back over to you and tell us, what is it that when you're thinking about, especially for you, because you are dealing with a lot of moving parts, you don't have one grape that you're dealing with many different grapes. So when you're visualizing, I've talked to you about this before, about how you visualize. We did that barrel tasting a number of years ago of your Zinfandel. You're trying out all these other barrels. How does the map in your head work? And what is your philosophy? Like, what are you looking for when you're making your wines? I'm
not sure I can say. It's a little bit like painting a picture, but it's not something you can really describe in words. It's just that you taste this barrel and that barrel and imagine how they're going to work together, and you can always do a bench trial to see too. But you get where you can kind of visualize how it's going to work.
I think you're very art, like you are more about the art, right? Like you really, because the blends are so challenging, it's less about the science and the pH and more about, does it taste right? Yeah.
A lot of it is done in the vineyard, so we pick the grapes together. We're committed to the blend, but then you were talking about the barrels. That's another layer of complexity. You can more variables to play with. But yes.
Yeah, but I would say, when I think about how you work, just having seen you work over so many years, because I've known you for so long, that a lot of you do it kind of in an old school way, in the sense that you do it by feel. You don't do a lot of the lab analysis. You're not doing all of that, right? You do some of it.
Kerith is much more of a scientist than I am.
So I think, but I think that's what the beauty of this is, right? Is that each of you have your own way of doing things. And I think you have figured out a way that I think is really interesting and unique, which is that you do it by feel, and you have to do it by feel because you have so much in the vineyard, right?
Right. It's like even the picking decisions, you have to to think about all the grapes. And like with the old Zinfandel vineyard, we usually get the Zinfandel probably a little riper than the other grapes, but it balances out that as the Zin gets ripe, you're losing some acid, but that's restored by some of the the Petit Terroir Alicante that's lagging a little bit behind. And we have to kind of look at the whole picture.
All right, I want to get back to you in a second, but why don't we move, Kerith? I would love to hear if Bill and I might be right on the fact that maybe you would take a more scientific approach, or is yours, have you given up on that because that was your first career and you said goodbye?
I guess it depends on what we're doing. I mean, in terms of, what was the original question? How do we
like your
pick
philosophy, how do you approach
right,
the wine, really? Because
right.
you also have all three of you have really unique and different ways of approaching the wine, and you each deal with very different grapes. And Kerith, you're dealing with something very difficult, which we'll get to later. Right now I just want to get kind of top level of how you look at the winemaking process.
Well, for me, I think the most important thing is to have wine that speaks to place. And I know that's true for Crux and ACORN too. So I make 4 single vineyard Pinot Noirs. And the reason I make 4 different single vineyard Pinot Noirs as opposed to blends is because for me, those specific sites speak to something special about the land and the climate and the sunshine and the fog that makes a wine from grapes that are grown in that specific place tastes different from Pinot Noir that's grown someplace else. And then from there, of course, having a medical background, I really do enjoy the science of fermentation and the science of winemaking. And for the rosé, I actually do bench trials for the color. So I'll look at adding back, 1% or 2% or 3% finished Pinot Noir from a neutral barrel, and I'll do it up to 5%. And, every single year it comes up being like 1.2%. And I still do the trial just because it's kind of fun and it looks really pretty to have all those shades of pink lined up in my kitchen, especially now that I'm working from home.
Yeah.
It is fantastic. And I think that especially for Pinot, the sense of place and showing how each different wine expresses itself is really essential. I do want to talk about Pinot in a second, but let's ask it looks like, did we lose Brian? Well, Steve
I'm
will
back.
ask. Oh, you're back? Okay, good. Let's ask you guys, I want to hit on this in a second, but Rhone, when we see Russian River Valley, we don't always think of Rhone. So your philosophy when you are blending and making these grapes, and I know you spend so much time in the vineyards, what's your kind of goal? I mean, what's the end idea, or what's the philosophy as you go into it? Or is it just sort of like you've been doing this so long, including the time in the garage, that you're like, we got this?
Well, first of all, you should think of Rhones when you think of the Russian River Valley. So
yes. Well, we'll get to that. We're going to talk about that in a second.
Okay, good. I love the notion of a field blend. We just don't have that field, I guess. We started planting. Our original planting was in 2005. Maybe with the benefit of years and years on these varietals, we would have it worked out to where they would be field blends, and our GSM, for instance, would be a field blend. I think that would be amazing. I just don't know how to achieve that in a short amount of time. So we take a different approach in that we try to essentially make 3 different wines that are as good as we can make them, and then we blend them by taste after that. So we don't really worry too much about the science of the blend, because the wines are, they're stable. They could be bottled on their own if we wanted them to be, and they would, they wouldn't suffer from that, other than they wouldn't taste how we want them to. So we use blending to improve the product. I think Rhone varietals have a real affinity for each other. The GSM blend, it is a classic blend, and there's a reason why it is. Those varietals help each other out to, I think, a great outcome.
Absolutely. Brian?
Well, it's our kind of joke is that we're making wines that we like to drink, because our exit strategy is if we can't sell them, we have to drink them. So you know, we're not trying to make wines to fit a market or any sort of, you know, profile. We're making wines that we enjoy drinking and hoping we can find some people who feel similarly.
I think you're doing a pretty good job. Bill, let's go back to you and talk about when you are doing the field blends and doing it in this old school. I mean, it's funny. I was reading something about Burgundy today and about how before phylloxera, everything was co-planted. And when you look at all of this, this is so very important, right? It's so very important to like give the nod back to history. And we do see people going back to the field blends. So the question I have is, what is, given that you have every single wine that you make is a field blend, although some are, you know, more field blendy than others, what's the hardest one to make and why?
I don't know whether it's the hardest, but the medley's the most complicated because we make, I planted a lot of unusual grapes, table grapes and a dozen different Muscat varieties. And I didn't know when I planted them whether they'd ripen all together, and it turns out they don't. So we have to go through, we do our first pick it makes only about 30 gallons, and then we come back and we do another pick. So what we call the medley based blend gets picked in usually about 3 picks. Then we combine those, put them in barrel for 8 months, and then we come back and taste to everything else and put together a blend of the blend. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's difficult. It's fun, but it's complicated. And it comes out a little different every year.
It's spectacular. If you have not had the Acorn medley yet, you need to try it. It is a must try. It is a spectacular wine and totally different, not totally different, but slightly different every year. I love it. I look forward to drinking it every year. Bill, actually, Kerith has a question for you. She wants to know, how do you identify the different varietals and how do you decide which esoteric varietals to plant?
Well, you can identify the varieties mainly by their leaf shape. One of the first things I did when we bought the old vineyard, we had just the Zinfandel vineyard at that time, was to walk up and down the row with this book and identify some of the varieties we had. And the people who I bought the vineyard from knew they had Zinfandel and Petit Rhone Alicante, but they didn't know the names of the other grapes. And some of them were not in the book. So then I carried leaves up to UC Davis and walked up and down a vineyard where a lot of varieties were planted in alphabetical order. And that's how I finally found out we had Sangiovese in the old blend, which had been introduced there by a fellow named Raffanelli back in 1950. But then I later discovered there's a vineyard near Davis in Winters called the National Germplasm Repository, and it's like a seed bank for grapes where they're maintaining a lot of grapevines that are planted 2 by 2 on several acres, just so that they won't go extinct and they'll be available for plant breeders. So that's where I found a lot of things that nobody else has. It seemed a shame that nobody else was growing them, so I had to give them a home. But then to answer Kerith's question, it also helps to try to remember where I planted things. But sometimes the leaf shapes are pretty similar, and other times they're very distinct.
I just want to make a small comment here, which is that for those of you listening to this, I mean, just think about if you were a large winery, the inability to do this kind of work. And when you are thinking about these smaller wineries and you think about why Laura and I and everybody here are so passionate about the small wineries, is because this kind of work, this kind of, intellectual exercise that Bill has gone through basically for 30 years, because I know you continue to do this, is is so unique. And without small wineries doing this kind of work, we would have such a homogenized product. And this is partially, you know, for so many reasons, but this is really partially why it's such a fantastic thing to have you, and to have you teach us that it's not just one way to do things, right? There's many ways to do things. And it's a highly intellectual process. I mean, Bill did not tell you before, but he was a pretty high powered attorney before he stopped doing that many years ago. And he has churned all that brain power into liquid gold. So pretty awesome. How's your white project going?
Well, it's looking good. We planted a Gruner Veltliner field blend and an Alvarinho field blend. So it was kind of a nod to my grandparents. My grandfather came from Austria in the 1890s and worked in vineyards in Napa, and my grandmother was born in Petaluma, but her family was Portuguese. So we have an Austrian field blend and a Portuguese field blend. And the Gruners mixed with other things like Roter Veltliner and Traminer, and I have to look at the list. I have to learn how to pronounce some of them too, and a few Hungarian grapes that are even harder to pronounce.
Hungarian is very difficult.
On the Portuguese side with the Alvarinho, we have clones of Alvarinho and Albarino, which are the same grape. And then there's Arinto and let me pick up the piece of paper, Malvasia, Fina, Lorero, and so on. And so we're just trying to make a couple of complex white wines. And so far they're tasting very nice.
I'm excited for that. I think the other thing that's pretty exciting is that you're staying true to you planted a whole new field and you're staying true to the field blend. So it's not like you've gone off the reservation on that.
Yeah, we've carried the field blend idea into all our new plantings.
Yeah, which means you really actually believe in it, as opposed to you just inherited something and said, this is what we have to work with.
Actually varietally labeled. So they're 75% or more one variety. We have a few things like the medley and another one called Acorn Hill that are not.
But still all field blends regardless, even if it's just a small percentage, right. And it does make a difference. All right, Kerith, I want to ask you about Pinot. And I want to know, we always talk about Pinot and it being like the heartbreak grape and it being so difficult to work with. And you have some estate fruit, you have your own vineyard, but you buy a lot of fruit and you buy it from different places because you are trying to express the different terroir. So how much of a pain is Pinot to deal with? Is it really that difficult?
Right. So as you mentioned, Josh Jensen sort of brought the romance and the myth of Pinot Noir to everybody's heart when he wrote The Heartbreak Grape, and the story of his trying to grow his Pinot Noir in the most chalky soil so it could be most like Burgundy in all of California, and then sideways continued the myth. And do you want to know the secret? It's actually harder to grow and ferment Zinfandel than it is to do Pinot, because Zin ripens super unevenly and it always gets stuck. But that said, Pinot can be persnickety. It doesn't like a ton of heat. It doesn't like it to be too cold, but it has to definitely get cool overnight. It's thin skin, so we're always working really hard to extract color, to extract mid-palate, because all of those, the color and the texture, those things and the flavor come from the skins. So if you're starting with a thin skin grape, then everything you do when you vinify that grape has to be in concert to build those things up, right? In contrast to, say, Napa Cabernet, where you're always trying to tame the sugar and tame the tannins. So that's, I think, one of the big differences with Pinot. And it's also really, really delicate. So you have to be judicious with oak, or you're going to end up with something that tastes like Home Depot 2x4, So it requires, I think, a little bit more of a delicate hand.
And so when since the vineyard is so important, how are you, do you get do you ever look at the vineyards and think I should go try to find different ones, or are you happy with who you have, or what's the you're constantly, this is what I love about you. You're constantly striving for better, the best. You're very type A, which I love.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if you ever do that to yourself, or whether you're like, this is good. I'm good. I'm making good wine and I'm happy. Or do you Kerith yourself?
I do Kerith myself a little bit, I'll be honest. I love the growers I work with, and I love the sites where I source from, because I have 3 different AVAs for Pinot, and they're all distinctly different. That said, I do often feel wistful because I really liked my 09 Anderson Valley Pinot. And this past harvest, 2020, I had the opportunity to buy some fruit up in Anderson Valley in Mendocino, which is really, really fun because, again, it's a totally different personality of Pinot Noir. So I'm going to be adding that to my armamentarium and bringing back Anderson Valley for the first time in 10 years. So I'm really excited about that as well. There was a time when I wanted to have more than the vineyards I had, and my husband, whom I call the CF No, said, you can't buy 1 ton of fruit from 15 different vineyards. Like, that makes no sense. You really have to hone it down. And at that point, I really just decided to focus on the growers that I like as people, the people whom I enjoy working with, and the vineyards, again, that really have a lot of personality.
And so could you give us an example? So you make 2 wines out of Petaluma Gap, right? And you make a lot of other wines too. You make another wine in Santa Lucia Highlands, you make another one in Russian River, now Anderson Valley. So can you just take 2 of those wines and talk about the difference between them, so we can understand, when you're looking at Pinot, why is that, Scott Olson just asked this question also. How does Monterrey, how does Santa Lucia Highlands differ from Russian River Valley? Or how do even the 2 Petaluma Gap wines differ from each other? Scott also wanted to know, he's a big Pinot head, he loves Pinot. Do you only use neutral oak, or some new oak, or, all of that? So if you could talk about both of those things, that'd be great.
Yeah, so actually, let's do this, Scott. Let's talk about Petaluma Gap versus Santa Lucia Highlands, because at first glance, you're going to think they're really, really similar. So Petaluma Gap has a terroir that's a byproduct of the geography. So it's the only AVA that's actually defined by the wind, and the pattern of fog to wind is defined by the Mayakama Mountains. So the Petaluma Gap sits between the Pacific Ocean and the Mayakama Mountains. And just as you can imagine, the fog comes off the bay in the morning, it sits in those vineyards. The sun starts to come up, it warms up the day, you hit the peak of the day, and the grapes get toasty warm around 4 o'clock, and right around 4 o'clock, like clockwork, the wind comes off the bay. And that's really important because the wind, number 1, it's going to dry up the fog, so it mitigates any rot pressure. Number 2, the wind thickens up the skin, so you're going to get a little bit more texture and a little bit more body than you might expect for a coastal Pinot Noir. And of course, number 3, it keeps the grapes cool so they maintain their acidity. So Petaluma Gap Pinot Noirs are really characterized by having a vibrant acidity, often a red fruit character. They have a little bit more body and texture than you might expect for some of those, what they call extreme Sonoma Coast Pinot Noirs. And they're very lively and food friendly. And then you go over down to the Santa Lucia Highlands, which is under the umbrella of Monterrey. The coldest jet of water coming into the Pacific Ocean on the coast of California is Monterrey. And that's because of this thing called the Blue Grand Canyon. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's like big craters that sit just off the coast of Monterrey. So that brings in this really cold jet of air. So I'm going to tell you that in the Santa Lucia Highlands, which is sort of nestled between 2 mountain ranges, you're going to get fog in the morning and wind in the afternoon. And you're going to say, that sounds exactly like the Petaluma Gap. You're crazy. They can't be that different. But here's the big difference. In the Santa Lucia Highlands, that wind starts churning through at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, which means that the temperatures never get as hot as they do down here and up here in Sonoma. They never hit the peak of the day. So people like to joke, like Randy Caprasso at the Psalm Journal always jokes that the grapes wear sweaters instead of bikinis. So this really is sort of a cool climate Pinot Noir, it never has the opportunity to get as warm as it does in the Petaluma Gap. And that change in climate has profound impact on the flavor. In Santa Lucia Highlands, you get a lot more of savory flavors, chaparral, California Bay, some sort of beautiful garrigue-like notes, which is usually an adjective we think about with Rhone that I think definitely ACORN and Crux can attest to, but you're gonna find some of that in the Santa Lucia Highlands. And the wind is so extreme in SLH, it shuts down photosynthesis. So you're gonna get a long hang time and thicker skins. So my Santa Lucia Highlands Pinot tends to have bigger shoulders than say San Giacomo coming out of the Petaluma Gap.
I do want to make a comment, which you're not going to like, Kerith, but I will say the following. I contacted Kerith after this because Santa Lucia Highlands sent me a bunch of wines. I'm going to write a blog post about this. I have it, you know, kind of mapped out. But beyond you and maybe one or two others, I did not think that the fruit was handled particularly well in Santa Lucia Highlands, at least from the sample that I had. And I have to say, I don't know that everybody looks at the Pinot and the terroir like you do in Santa Lucia Highlands, because there's a lot of Chateau 2x4 there. And there's a lot of like, there feels like there's a lot of cover up, you know, it feels like there's a lot of like, we messed up the fruit and now there's cover up. But you don't do that. And, you know, what's his name? Adam Lee, also his project doesn't do that, but there's a lot of like, you want to talk about sweater, there's a sweater plus an oak. And so, you know, you're particularly talented in that way. All right, let's move to Crux because Steve, I promised you that I would talk about Rhone. And one of the things I think that Bill also, we didn't discuss this with Bill, but after we you know, kind of talk about this, I think the thing that is really important to point out is that Russian River Valley is not a monolith. And where Steve and Brian and Bill function is very different from where Kerith is. And so because of that, there are two distinct areas, or probably more than two distinct areas. But let's be clear that when we think about Russian River Valley, we cannot be thinking, okay, it's only Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And Rhone can be incredibly successful, and Italian varietals can be very successful, right? So can you guys talk about that and why Rhone and Russian River Valley are so well suited to, why Russian River Valley is so well suited to Rhone?
Is that a question for us?
It is a question for you, yes.
Okay. Well, you know, I think if you were to look at France and look at the proximity of the Rhone Valley to Burgundy, maybe that's part of the answer. You know, it's not that different. Of course, there south and north do different things, but in the Russian River Valley, north kind of moves you upriver and above the fog line, at least for more of the day. So in our neighborhood, there is some discussion about kind of calling breaking the Russian River Valley AVA into neighborhoods, and we're what's called the Middle Reach, and it's quite a bit warmer. There's an incredible variety of grapes in our area, the Russian River Valley, and I think in time we'll see less Pinot in our area. It is still grown here, but it makes, you know, a very different Pinot Noir than like what Kerith was describing, because it is warmer. And I think you know, some evidence of all this is that we really don't have trouble ripening our grapes in our area. Maybe there's a little bit of an exception of Mourvedre in a cool year, makes this work a little bit harder, but Syrah is I mean, it ripens easily here. Grenache needs a warmer site for sure, but again, we really don't have any trouble. I mean, we sometimes go into October, but I can't think of a year. It's been a long time since we had a real serious rain threat with Grenache. So I feel like we're using the season that we're given. We're not chopping off a month that where we have to pick because the grapes are getting too ripe, like often people in our area do with Pinot Noir. They pick in even late August in some of the recent incredibly hot summers we've had. So at the time, I think one of the reasons why we planted Zinfandel when we did, it was kind of hedging our bets. Like we looked around and said, well, we know we can do Zinfandel here because other people do it. So we felt like that was a secure thing, where the other things felt like a risk at the time. Looking back, I don't feel like it's a risk at all. Like I think that the Rhone varietals do really well here, and I'm glad that our area is not warmer. Especially with the recent years, incredible hot heat spikes in September that can be really damaging to grapes that are near harvest time. If you're a month out, it's not near as damaging when the grapes aren't that close to being ripe. So I'm pretty happy that we're not sitting at Labor Day worried about those heat spikes and what they're doing to our nearly ripe grapes.
I just have to say, your Mourvedre has almost ruined, your participation in underground wine events a number of times. Damn Mourvedre.
I almost drank it tonight in honor of you, or in spite of you.
Thanks a lot, Brian. I mean,
but I didn't.
Laura and I sat on pins and needles waiting for that. So, Brian, do you think that over the years, more people have been like, yeah, Rhone, I get it. Like, has it caught on yet? Do you feel like?
Well, certainly in our experience, yes. I mean, yeah. we're trying to educate people. I mean, they still need a lot of education because people don't know how to pronounce Viognier and Mourvedre, and some of them never heard of it.
Are you talking about
a lot of, yeah, that's one example. But we're very much educating the public because it's the what is it, the 7 grapes that make up 92% of the wine in the world. I mean, we're fighting against that because I think Syrah is one of them, but the rest of them really are not. But that actually kind of makes our job pleasurable because we get to introduce people to something new and help them, demystify it really. And that's very satisfying.
Well, you're certainly not alone because, in these future things, we've got Kieran Robinson who's doing Syrah and Viognier, and, you look in Dry Creek, there's a whole bunch of people doing it. And I think there's maybe some recognition that maybe not everybody in the hotter sites of Russian rivers should be doing Pinot, even though they feel that's what sells. You need a cooler site to do that, right?
Well, yeah, and those are people that obviously have better financial advisors than we do. That's where the money is. I mean, you can sell your grapes for several $1,000s more than you get for Rhone varietals. But that's one of our challenges, given that it's so scarce, and the fact that we only have 3 acres of vineyards, is finding grapes that are a quality we appreciate within, a few mile radius of our home wines and home vineyards. That's challenging. We don't have a dozen options for Grenache. There's probably 3 or 4. And, we've used a couple of them and found one that we're perfectly matched with. It's very similar to what we're growing in our home vineyards. Similar farming practices. They ripen differently, but that's based on the site. So
do you guys get into the vineyards? Do you go in, for the contract farmers? I mean, Bill is the only one here who sources 100% from his site. So for you guys, you go in there and you work with them?
Well, we've been working with most of our vineyards since 2012 when we first started commercially. So we've got relationships. We know the vineyards. We are absolutely out there. I mean, certainly more weighted towards the end of the season to the beginning of the season, but we've had a lot of conversations with the growers and the vineyard management companies that are out there doing the work for us. And again, especially as we get past veraison, we're out there quite often looking at the fruit. We'll have conversations if we see something we think needs to be done or done differently. It's absolutely feet on the ground.
And again, that's small winery, right?
Right. And the advantage for Steve and I is we have very small blocks of every grape we make wine with except Grenache Blanc. So we have personal experience with what we're doing, what the vineyards will do, and that absolutely translates to how we work with our growers.
And what's your hardest wine to make? Let me guess.
Well, I
Is
think
it?
there's two answers to that. I think Mourvèdre is difficult in the vineyard. It's difficult to get it perfectly ripe. I think in the winery, Grenache is a bit of a pain in the butt. Can be, because it shows any mistakes you make or any bad practices you have are glaring. It doesn't hide things. Where Mourvèdre is a little bit more tolerant in the winery. It's just hard to get the perfect Mourvèdre. I feel like that's like something that torments me constantly is the perfect Mourvèdre grapes.
I feel that. I feel like I've been with you on that journey, Laura, and I have felt the Mourvèdre pain.
You just don't think there is such a thing.
What pain about Mourvèdre? I mean, I think it's worth
No, a
it.
perfect Mourvèdre.
No, but you make really good stuff, so I guess it's working out. So, when and any of you guys can answer this, I just really want to talk about the role of small wineries. Obviously, we're very passionate about it, but what do you think in today's wine world? We have obviously something going on right now, which is not great. How do we look at the role of small wineries in terms of the whole picture? I mean, we have these 800-pound gorillas who make incredibly homogenized wine. It's basically factory wine, right? They're just churning. It could be anything. It could be juice, right? They flavor it. They do whatever. They're not really working with the land. I think we can all kind of agree with that. They're able to finesse whatever. So, what is the role of the small producer? Do you feel like the foothold is strong? Do you worry about the future of small producers? Do you feel hopeful in spite of obviously current challenges, which will pass, thank goodness, knock wood? Kerith, Dr. Overstreet can tell us about that. But I feel that, I think that there's opportunities and there's challenges, and especially in California, where if you were operating in a different place, like if you were in Virginia or the Finger Lakes or even Washington, there's a few there's no big players really in the Finger Lakes or Virginia, but Washington, Oregon, they're big, but they're not big like what's in California. So how do you function as a small winery, and what do you rely on? Because I think people really need to hear that, the importance of what you rely on to stay alive and what you think your future is.
It has gotten harder and harder for small wineries to distribute their wine, because at the same time the number of wineries has gone up, the number of distributors has gone down, and they tend to concentrate on the larger brand. So the problem is people really have to go out of their way to find us. It's and if you can't come to California, then we have to ship it to you, and that's a lot harder than just walking down to the corner grocery store or liquor store, and so it takes dedication from the consumer to or being willing to seek out unusual wines.
And also, I think that small wineries are lucky and uniquely positioned to build relationships with people who love and drink wine. If you email Crux, Brian or Steve is going to email you back. If you email Gallo, Ernest and Julio are not going to email you. I can guarantee that. If you call Acorn, Betsy's going to pick up the phone. And we're grateful for that. Like, I know that, Scott Olson has brought my wine to his mom's house for Easter. And that's so touching to me. And Alan and his wife sent me bottle shots from Thanksgiving. And I love that. And I just don't think that consumers feel that kind of special personal connection with those big behemoth brands. So I think for small wineries, we can really embrace this time of sheltering at home, because it's really like our Super Bowl. This is our opportunity for everybody out here listening to have a different bottle of wine on their table every night at dinner when they are ordering in or cooking from home, because that's what we're all doing. Like, this is our big chance. This is our chance to be with you guys every single night until at least the vaccine's widely available, or here in California until mid-February?
By the way, Scott's mother is a lovely woman, so I'm glad that Scott, I love your mom, as you know. So I will say, yeah, I think that that's completely true. And I think that that personal connection of understanding that, I mean, I obviously, you know, I'm a people are always like surprised. I'm a one person shop too. That's why I take so long to do everything. Like, but I think that that's the thing is like, you're going to get, if you're sending an email, it's coming through me, not coming through anybody else. And I think that that's true, that you all are aware of what's going on, as opposed to even a medium-sized winery where you're not going to get the winemaker or the owner. All right, Steve and Brian, you add your 2 cents in here too, please.
Well, I think it's clear for us, our objective is not to be everything for everyone. You know, we are not, we're a 2-man operation. I mean, I guess we're better than one because there's 2 of us, but our objective from the get-go was to be a 2-man operation. And we kind of scaled it and planned it around what we thought we could do. Although as we get older, we're maybe reducing the amount of our efforts or our ambition. But it is the personal connection. I think this is a great opportunity for small wineries like ours, because I think people are kind of reassessing values, and you know, the whole shop small, shop local kind of thing is growing. And, you know, it is not our objective to be in distribution in every state, although as much as we'd love for our wine to be accessible, we just can't play at that level, and that's not our intention by any means.
And I think,
Sorry, Steve.
Oh, Steve, do you want to?
Okay. You know, I just a thing I would like to add too is I think it's up to small wineries to drive changes in taste, really. The big guys, they don't care about Gruner Veltliner that Bill is planting. They're gonna provide the same grapes that everybody's buying. So it's kind of up to small wineries to provide the alternatives and get a following for that, and hope that the popularity increases, because the big guys are just not going to do that.
Yeah, you're tastemakers, and you're also individuals, right? I mean, that's your individualists versus just being a faceless nothing. And I think, Brian, you know, your point about not being everywhere or everything to everybody, I know it's frustrating for everybody who's listening to this, like, oh, I wish I could get their wines on my shelf. But I do think that even though it takes a little bit of effort to order a 6-pack or whatever, I mean, just even doing it a couple of times a year, joining the wine clubs, or just going on and ordering a la carte, I think really just mixes it up for you, and it teaches you something. It gives you something different, and introducing it to your friends and other people also to just show them the world that's out there. I love to see that people shared it at Thanksgiving and that you're sharing it with other people, spreading the word. I will say that I feel like I totally relate. I'm a small business and I relate to everybody this is why I love working with all of you. It's just word of mouth. Like, we don't have the money or the resources to go out and just pump, you know, stuff all over the world and let everybody know. And we're small operations, but I think the idea that ultimately we are all trying to really make personal connections is so different. It's just different from how the world has been functioning. And I think it's really great. All right, we're going to stop the Facebook Live now. So we're going to say goodbye to our Facebook friends. Would you guys be willing to talk to the patrons for a second? All right,
Absolutely.
let me just stop the live stream. All right, Laura, did that work? Okay.